It was a quiet night, and the sky was full of stars, and the wind was soft and cool, and everything felt peaceful and calm as if the world was sleeping without. A man named Ray was standing in his small garden behind his house, and he was planting some herbs and humming an old tune and thinking about nothing much, and life was slow in this little town, and he liked it that way, and nothing strange ever happened. Here the moon was shining bright and the crickets were singing, and the smell of the soil made him feel calm and happy, and he thought this would be just another normal night like always, but then something changed, and he felt it before he saw it, and the wind stopped and the crickets went silent and the air became heavy like it was holding its breath. He looked up at the sky and saw a strange flash of light moving fast above the trees, and it was not a shooting star and it was not a plane, and it made no sound but left a faint green trail behind as it disappeared beyond the hills. Ray blinked and stared, and for a moment he thought maybe his eyes played tricks on him, and maybe it was nothing but something inside him said no, this was not normal and something was wrong. And then he heard a soft rustling sound from the bushes near the edge of the garden, and it was too slow to be the wind and too heavy to be a rabbit or a fox, and he stepped back and grabbed his shovel just in case. Then from the shadows came a woman, and she stumbled forward holding something close to her chest, and her clothes were torn and her hair was messy and her face was pale and tired and her eyes were wide with fear. She fell to her knees right in front of him, and her lips were trembling and her voice was weak and broken, and she looked up at him and whispered with shaking hands, "Please don't let them take her." And then she collapsed. Ray dropped the shovel and ran to her, and he knelt down and saw that she was barely breathing and her hands were wrapped tightly around a small bundle, and when he gently pulled the cloth aside, he saw a baby inside sleeping peacefully with soft skin and tiny fingers curled like petals. He looked back at the woman and said, "Hey, are you okay, and who are you and what happened?" But she did not answer, and her eyes slowly closed and her chest stopped moving and she was gone. He sat there in shock with the baby in his arms, and the night around him was silent again, but the silence did not feel peaceful anymore. It felt like the quiet before a storm. Ray stood up and looked around, and his heart was racing, and he did not know what to do or who to call, and he had so many questions and no answers, and the baby was still sleeping like nothing had happened, and her skin felt warm but strange, like it was too smooth or too perfect. He walked inside the house and locked the door and placed the baby gently on the couch and covered her with a blanket, and then he went back outside to the garden. But the woman was gone. There were no footprints and no signs, and it was like she had vanished into thin air, and Ray felt a chill run down his spine, and he knew he was not imagining things, and he had held her and heard her voice and seen her die. Then he saw something near the flower bed, and he picked it up, and it was a small silver cube glowing faintly, and it felt cold and heavy, and it had strange symbols on it that he could not understand, and when he touched the side a soft hum came from it, like a machine waking up. He heard a sound in the distance like a deep growl mixed with metal scraping, and it came from the woods, and it was getting closer, and it did not sound human or safe. Ray looked back at the house and then at the trees and then at the cube in his hand, and he knew something was coming, and he did not know what it was, but he knew it was looking for the baby. He ran inside and locked all the windows and turned off the lights and kept the baby close and waited in the dark with the cube in his hand and fear in his chest and questions in his mind. Who was she? What was this cube? Why did she say don't let them take her hand? Most of all, who are they? And then just outside in the woods something screamed asterisk. The night was long and Ray did not sleep, and the baby did not cry, and outside the wind howled like something lost was calling out, and the shadows moved like they were alive and hungry, and Ray sat near the window holding the cube in one hand and watching the trees with wide tired eyes. Time the leaves rustled, he froze, and every time a branch creaked he tightened his grip, and every time silence returned he asked himself if he was going mad or if something truly strange was happening here in his quiet corner of the world. The baby slept like nothing mattered, like nothing outside could touch her, and Ray found that strange and almost unreal, because how could a child sleep through such fear and stillness unless she was used to it, or unless she was something more than just a child? As morning came and light pushed through the curtains, he dared to breathe again, and he stood and walked to the kitchen with the baby in his arms and made warm milk and searched for something soft to wrap her in, and found an old knitted blanket his mother once gave him, and it felt warm and right, and he wrapped the baby gently as if she were glass and sat down on the floor again with her in his lap. She opened her eyes slowly, and for a moment he forgot everything because her eyes were glowing with a soft blue light, not bright, not blinding, just soft like the sky before dawn, and they blinked at him as if she could see through him, and he felt like she could read every memory and every thought, and yet he felt no fear, only calm, like he was being told not to worry. The cube on the table started to hum again, and he looked at it confused and a little afraid, but the baby turned her head toward it and it stopped, and the hum faded like a wave pulling back, and Ray could not explain what he saw, but he knew this child had a connection with it, a bond like it was made for her, or she was made for a trade. Turned on the old television, and every channel showed the same thing: news anchors with tight faces talking about an object that fell from the sky and a crash site sealed by military and strange energy spikes detected, and officials saying everything was under control. But Ray knew they were lying. He could see it in their eyes and hear it in their voices, and he remembered the woman in his garden and her last words, and the thing in the woods that screamed. He held the baby closer and looked around. his small house and realized it was no longer safe and that hiding would not work forever and someone or something would come for her, and he had no idea what to do. The doorbell rang, just one soft chime, like a whisper, like a trap waiting to be opened. He stood still for a long time, not moving, not breathing, and then slowly walked to the door and looked through the peephole and saw two men in black suits with clean faces and sharp eyes standing outside, like they belonged to some secret place, and he did not like their eyes, because they were not curious or kind. They were searching. Ray opened the door a little, and one of the men smiled and said in a smooth voice that they were from the National Safety Division and were looking for any fallen objects or people in the area, and if Ray had seen or heard anything strange last night. And Ray said no, and the baby stayed quiet in his arms and the cube stayed silent behind the curtain. The other man leaned forward and asked if anyone had come to his house, and Ray said no again and tried to close the door, but before he could, the first man said something that made his blood turn cold. He said, "We are looking for a very specific type of child, and we believe she may be nearby. And we are here to protect people like you from people like her." Ray forced a laugh and said he had no children. And the men nodded and walked away, but one of them looked back just once and stared at the curtain for a long second before turning and leaving. Ray closed the door fast and locked every bolt and held the baby tight and whispered to her that he would not let them take her, not ever, and he did not care what she was or where she came from because someone gave her to him, and that meant he had a reason. Now later that day, the cube changed color and turned green and started to show shapes in the air, like maps, like stars, like paths to somewhere, and Ray watched it like a man trying to read a dream. And the baby looked at the lights and laughed for the first time, and the sound was soft and sweet and full of something he could not name. He did not know where the cube wanted him to go or what waited at the end of the map, but he knew one thing very clearly: now he could not stay here. The stars were starting to fade as dawn broke slowly across the sky in the forest outside. Ray's window stood still like it was waiting for something, and the baby in his arms had fallen asleep again, but her tiny fingers still glowed faintly in the dark, and the silver cube beside them pulsed with a rhythm that felt like breathing. Ray had packed a bag filled with milk and clothes and an old flashlight and a small knife he never thought he would need, and his hands were shaking and his breath was shallow, but his mind was set because staying here meant danger and waiting meant death, and something deep inside him knew they were already coming. He walked outside into the morning mist, and the world felt quieter than it should have been, and every tree and every leaf and every bird seemed to be holding its voice, and the wind was gone and the air was thick. And Ray tightened the blanket around the child and stepped into the woods where he used to play as a boy, never imagining one day he would be running through them with a baby, not quite human, and a glowing cube in his pocket. He moved quickly between the trees, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches, and every sound made him stop and listen because he knew he was not alone. And the baby pressed her head into his chest and whispered something in a soft voice that sounded like a name, but it was not in any language he had ever heard, and it echoed in his ears like a forgotten song behind him in the distance. He heard it again, that same sound from the night before, a roar that did not belong to any creature of Earth. And it was closer now and louder and sharper, and it carried weight like metal being torn apart, or the cry of a machine with a soul. Began to run. He ran until his legs burned and his chest ached, and the trees blurred past him like shadows with eyes, and he did not stop until he reached the old ranger's cabin deep in the woods where no one came anymore. And he kicked open the door and locked it behind him and sat down on the floor with the baby in his arms and tried to breathe again. Inside the cabin was dust and silence and a few broken tools and a rusted radio that did not work, and Ray leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes just for a moment, just to think, just to rest. But then the cube began to glow again, and this time the light rose from it and floated in the air like a ghost and formed a shape that looked like a person or maybe a woman, and she began to speak. The voice was soft but powerful, and it spoke in two languages at once, one that Ray understood and one that he did not. And it said, "If you are seeing this, then they have found you, and the child is in danger, and there is no safe. It's a place anymore, but there is a safe path. If you follow the map and do not trust those who smile without light in their eyes." The vision ended and the cube dimmed, and Ray sat there stunned and silent, and the baby looked up at him and touched his face with her tiny glowing fingers and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made him feel like he could keep going even when he was full of fear. But then he heard the sound again, and this time it was not far, and it was not alone. He stood up quickly and peeked out the window and saw dark shapes moving between the trees, long and tall and wrong like shadows, wearing skin, and their eyes glowed red, and their bodies made no sound when they moved, and the forest did not fight them because even nature feared them. One of them looked straight at the cabin. Ray stepped back and held the baby close and grabbed the knife with his other hand, and he did not know what he could do against such things. But he knew he would not run anymore, and he would not give her up, and if they wanted her they would have to come through him first. The door creaked, something touched the handle. Ray backed away slowly, and held the cube tight, and the baby whispered again, and this time the cube answered and sent out the blast of light that knocked Ray backward and shook the cabin walls, and when he opened his eyes, he saw that the door was still closed and everything outside was silent again, but only for a moment because the cabin roof cracked and something landed on top with a weight that bent the wood, and the baby began to cry for the first time, and her cry was not like a normal cry. It was filled with something ancient and strange, and the cube responded with another glow, this one blue and calm, and it wrapped around them like a shield, and Ray understood they were not here to take her because she was dangerous, they were here to take her because she was powerful, and they were afraid. The roof held for only a moment longer before it cracked again, and this time something sharp punched through the wood and sent pieces flying, and Ray grabbed the baby and rolled across the cabin floor. Just as the ceiling gave in and a figure dropped into the room, silent and slow like a spider made of smoke and metal. The creature had no face and no mouth, only a smooth helmet with red slits for eyes and long arms that moved like broken clock hands, and its body hissed like steam from a dead engine, and it turned its head toward the child and stepped forward with a hunger that felt cold, and ancient Ray stood between them without thinking and shouted, but the thing did not flinch, and it raised one of its arms and it changed shape right in front of him, forming something like a blade or a claw, or maybe both, and Ray knew he would die here and the child would be taken and the world might never know what it lost. But the baby did not cry this time, and the cube in Ray's pocket began to shake and glow and then rise into the air, and a wave of light burst out and threw the creature back through the wall like a leaf in a storm, and it vanished into the trees with a loud screech that shook the windows. Ray stared at the cube as it floated in front of him, spinning slowly and drawing lines of light in the air like a map, and as he watched, the lines formed shapes and circles and glowing points that shifted and moved like stars, and he realized he was looking at something greater than a map. He was looking at a sky that was not Earth's. Baby touched the light, and the lines moved and zoomed in on one of the glowing points, and suddenly Ray could hear a sound, not with his ears but in his head, and it was soft and deep and full of sadness and strength, and it said, "Find the mountain that sleeps under fire and open the door that speaks with light, and there you will see the truth." He did not know what it meant, but he knew he had to go, and he had to go fast because the forest was no longer safe and more of those creatures would come, and maybe worse things would follow, and the signal was not just showing a place, it was calling something toward them, and time was running out. Ray wrapped the baby tight and took the cube and ran out of the broken cabin into the woods again, and the air felt hotter now and thicker, like something big was moving under the ground, and he did not look back because looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant death. He followed the map the cube showed him, even though it was floating in the air and changing as he moved, and he trusted it because the child trusted it, and every time she looked at the path, her eyes glowed a little brighter, and her body hummed with a sound that Ray could feel in his bones. Past, or maybe more or maybe less, because time felt strange now, like it was bending around them, and the forest opened up into a valley he had never seen before, and there was a lake at the center that glowed faint green, and on the far side was a stone hill with smoke rising from the top and firelight flickering deep inside. He knew this was the mountain, and he knew this was the place the signal spoke of, and as he climbed the rocky path toward the fire, the cube pulsed with more energy, and the baby reached out toward the hill as if she already knew what was waiting there inside the cave at the top of the mountain. The walls were covered in old carvings and strange glowing roots that pulsed like veins, and at the center stood a large stone gate with no lock and no handle and no hinges, only light moving slowly across its surface like breath. He stepped forward, and the cube floated to the gate and sank into it, and the whole mountain shook as the gate opened like a mouth opening to speak, and from the other side came warmth and light and a feeling so heavy it almost knocked Ray to his knees, because it was not just a door, it was a voice made of light and stone and memory, and it said, "Welcome, protector, welcome, child, welcome." Signaled. The baby looked into the gate and smiled, and Ray felt her heartbeat match his, and for a second he forgot about the danger and the fear and the things chasing them, because here in this place under fire and stone he felt something real and strong and ancient waiting to be awakened. But then the mountain screamed, the earth split behind them, and dark shapes poured from the trees like ink spilled across the land, and the sky turned black as something massive blotted out the sun, and the air became thick with a smell like burning metal and old death. And Ray held the baby close and stepped through the gate into the light without looking back, because whatever waited on the other side had to be better than what was now behind them. The light from the gate swallowed them whole, and for a moment there was nothing but silence and color all around, like floating inside a dream or falling through a memory that did not belong to Ray, and he held the child tight against his chest as they drifted through the strange tunnel of light with no floor and no ceiling and no sound except the soft hum of the cube pulsing gently near his shoulder. The tunnel ended suddenly, and they stumbled forward onto stone ground, and the light faded into soft gold shadows, and Ray blinked and looked around and found himself standing in a wide-open chamber filled with strange machines and glowing roots that stretched from wall to wall like veins of some ancient living thing. The baby looked calm, and her eyes reflected the light from the walls, and Ray noticed that she was not afraid, not even a little, and that gave him the strength to keep moving forward toward the center of the chamber where a tall figure stood waiting. It was not human and not alien in the way he had imagined before. It looked more like stone shaped by wind and water and time, with a face that shifted like smoke and hands that glowed when it raised them and spoke without sound, using only thought and presence. And warmth of voice in Ray's mind said, "You have brought her here. And the path has opened and the signal has been heard, and now the choice must be made." And Ray asked, "What choice, and who are you? And what is this place?" And the voice answered only, "This is where it began and this is where it may end." The cube floated from Ray's hand and moved to the center of the chamber and opened like a flower, revealing a seed of pure light, and the baby reached toward it, and the moment her hand touched it, the entire room lit up with 1,000 memories flowing through the walls and into Ray's mind. He saw ships flying between stars and cities, made of crystal and fire, and wars that burned entire worlds, and he saw the woman who had died in his garden holding the baby and running through fields of red grass, chased by machines that wore human faces, and he saw her stand before a council and say she would protect the child with her life and that Earth was the only place left to hide. Ray dropped to his knees from the weight of it all, and the stone figure stepped closer and said, "The child is the lost key. She is the final voice of a race that was silenced, and if they take her, they will rewrite what was and shape what will be, and no one will remember the truth." Ray looked at the baby and saw something in her eyes. Not fear, not power, but hope, and it was more powerful than anything he had ever known. And he stood again and said, "Then we protect her no matter what." The chamber shook, and the air grew cold, and outside the gate they had come through cracked and hissed, and then burst open, and the hunters stepped through, not walking, not running, but floating like shadows, wrapped in armor and fire, with weapons that hummed, and eyes that burned red with hunger and hatred. Stood in front of the baby, and the cube shot beams of light across the chamber, creating a shield around them, and the hunters screamed and struck the barrier again and again, but it held, and the stone figure raised its arms and called down fire from the ceiling, like falling stars that exploded on impact, and slowed the hunters for only a moment more. Came through the gate, and then more, until there were too many to count, and the chamber grew darker, and Ray felt the ground shaking like the whole mountain was crying out, and he knew the shield would not hold forever. And he turned to the figure and shouted, "What do I do now?" And the voice replied, "The signal must be sent, she must speak, and the truth must reach the sky before the silence takes it all." The baby stood on her own feet and walked to the center of the chamber, and the cube rose above her head, and the light wrapped around her like wings, and then she spoke a single word in the old language, and every hunter stopped moving, and every weapon fell silent, and the fire in their eyes faded, and the darkness behind them peeled away like paper in the wind. The word echoed through the chamber and through the mountain and into the sky, and Ray knew it had traveled farther than sound, farther than light, and that someone or something out there had heard her and was now listening. But the mountain was breaking and the ceiling was falling, and the figure told Ray to run now and keep her safe and take her to the sky where she belongs. And Ray grabbed the child and ran through a new path that opened from the wall, lit by the same light that had saved them. And as he ran, he did not look back, because he knew the hunters were no longer the only ones coming. Something else was waking up. The tunnel was dark and cold and narrow, and the light behind Ray faded as the path closed, and the mountain above roared like a dying giant, and every step echoed with fear and fire, and the sound of the world shifting behind them, as if the ground itself wanted to forget what had happened. Ray held the baby close, and she was quiet again, her eyes still glowing softly, and her tiny hand holding the remains of the cube, which no longer pulsed or hummed or moved, but simply rested like a sleeping heart waiting to wake. He kept walking through the dark tunnel that twisted like a serpent and led him deeper into silence, and when he finally stepped out into the open air, the sky was different, not night, not day, just a soft gray that felt like ash floating on still water, and the land before him was not the same forest he had left. It was cold and flat and covered in broken machines and bones of ships and cities buried beneath the dust. Before he could take another step, something sharp struck the back of his head and everything went black. Ray woke up in a cold metal room with white walls and no windows and strange lights that buzzed softly, and the baby was gone, and his arms felt heavy and his mouth was dry, and the air smelled like chemicals and steel and regret. He sat up fast and shouted for her, but no voice answered, only the sound of boots on metal floors and a camera turning in the corner. And then the door opened and a man walked in wearing a uniform with medals and scars and a face that looked both proud and tired, like someone who had seen too much and learned too little. The man said his name was General Rowan, and that Ray had caused quite a lot of trouble, and that the child was safe for now, but under special care and protection and observation. And Ray said, "You have no idea what she is." And the general smiled and said, "Oh, I do." He pressed a button on the wall and a screen lit up showing files and images and videos of the child from the moment she arrived, and all the things she did and all the places she had been. And the general said, "We have been tracking her for years before she even arrived on Earth, and we knew someone would bring her here, and we were ready." Ray said, "Ready for what?" And the general leaned closer and whispered, "Ready to make Earth strong again." The truth fell like a hammer. They did not want to protect her, they wanted to use her, they wanted to study her and copy her and turn her into something they could control, something they could build into weapons and armies and systems of fear. And the cube was gone, and the gate was closed, and the signal had been blocked, and no one out there could hear them. Ray was locked away for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. Time was strange in this place, and he was fed and kept alive, but never told where she was or what they were doing to her, until one night when the door to his cell slid open and a woman stepped inside wearing a technician's suit and a face he did not know but eyes that told him to trust her. She said nothing, only handed him a keycard and walked away, and Ray followed the map she left scratched into his food tray and moved through the base like a shadow, past guards and scanners and locked doors until he reached the chamber deep underground, where the child was kept in a glass room surrounded by wires and lights and machines that hummed with hunger. She looked up when she saw him and smiled and touched the glass, and it melted away like water, and Ray rushed in and held her and whispered, "I am here and I am sorry and I will never let them take you again." But the general was watching. Sirens screamed and lights turned red and the voice in the ceiling shouted protocol breach and security lockdown, and Ray knew they would not make it far, not without help. And then the cube pulsed again in the baby's hand, glowing faintly with the last bit of light it had left. She crazed it above her head, and it sent out a new signal, not one of location, not one of words, but of truth, a memory wave that spread across the base and filled every screen and every mind with the history of what had happened to her people, the war, the betrayal, the genocide, the silence, and the hope placed in her. Soldiers dropped their weapons and scientists stepped back, and even General Rowan froze as the truth filled his mind, and for the first time he saw not a weapon, not a threat, not a tool, but a child alone and scared and powerful and full of something Earth had lost long ago. He stepped forward, but Ray stepped in front of him and said, "We are leaving now," and this time no one followed. They walked through halls now quiet and empty, and the gate was gone and the cube was fading and the baby rested in his arms, and Ray knew this was not the end, because now everyone knew. The world outside the base was quiet and wide and gray, like the earth itself had paused to listen, and Ray walked slowly across the broken ground holding the child close, while above them the sky shifted with light and color, and far in the distance thunder rolled without sound. Its step felt heavy and soft and full of weight, as if time itself had grown tired, and the child no longer glowed but breathed gently, like the storm within her had passed, or perhaps simply waited for what would come next. Behind them the base stood silent and still. No soldiers followed, no alarms sounded, no guns fired, because the truth had reached them and broken something inside, something made of fear and metal and lies. And Ray did not look back, because he knew the choice ahead was greater than the battles behind. The cube had turned into a shell of what it was, no longer bright, no longer humming, just quiet and cracked in the child's hands, like it had done all it could, and now it watched like a tired guide, waiting for the path to end. Ray walked until he reached a ridge, and beyond it stretched the valley, where the stars once fell and the ships once rose and the gate had once stood, and now only scorched earth and flickering light remained. But above it all, something hung in the sky, something vast and silver and alive, something not made by human hands. A ship larger than any mountain and shaped like a wing wrapped in flame hovered above the valley, and its light shone down like a second sun, not burning, not blinding, just there, like a question left at the end of a long story. The child looked up and smiled, and her eyes turned golden for the first time, and she whispered a word that Ray could not understand, and the ship responded by sending a beam of soft light toward them that curved and twisted like silk and water and settled on the ground before them, opening like a door without walls. Ray stepped forward holding her close, and felt warmth in the air and in his skin and in his thoughts, as if the ship was speaking to him, not with words but with memories and feelings and hopes and sorrow. And it asked a question, not with sound but with stillness and silence. The question was simple and yet deeper than anything he had ever known. Will you let her go? Will you give her back to the stars? Will you trust that her place is not here? He looked at the child, and she looked at him and touched his face, and in her eyes he saw not fear but understanding, and in her heart he felt not pain but peace. And he knew that she was not meant for Earth, and that Earth was not ready for her, not yet. But still he hesitated, because in the short time they had shared, he had become more than a protector, and she had become more than a secret. And in the silence of nights and the terror of chases, they had become something like family, and letting her go felt like tearing out a piece of himself and giving it to the stars. The light around them shifted again, and from the sky another figure descended, not like the hunters, not like the soldiers, but like a shadow of the woman who had first whispered, "Please do not let them take her." And Ray saw her face again, soft and kind and full of fire, and she reached out her hand and touched the child's head and smiled. She spoke in the same way the ship did, with light and memory and warmth, and she said, "Thank you. And you did not fail." And now she must choose. The child stepped down from Ray's arms and stood in the center of the beam, and the cube floated again, glowing softly one last time and spinning slowly like a clock ticking toward its final moment. And she placed her hand on it, and the world held its breath. Ray felt time slow and spacefold, and the air filled with music that had no sound, and the ground rose like waves beneath him. And when he looked again, the child was gone, and the ship had risen higher, and the light had faded into the clouds. The cube fell into his hands, cold and still and heavy, and he stood there, alone in the valley, with nothing but wind and dust and silence and the soft beating of his heart. But then the cube pulsed once more, and a small voice filled his mind, not loud, not sad, just clear and bright, and it said, "Thank you. I will return when it is time." Ray smiled with tears in his eyes and turned to walk back across the ridge where the earth waited and the sky watched and the silence now felt full, not empty, full of meaning, full of memory, full of truth. The world would change now because someone had heard the signal, someone had seen the truth, someone had made the choice on it. Somewhere out among the stars, a child carried the hope of more than one world, and a man once lost in his garden had become part of something greater than he could ever have imagined, and he would wait because he believed.